What is black tea? In this video, we're going to find out. We're going to take a look at 4 different black teas and see what makes them different in terms of taste and appearance. Normally on this channel, we travel all around Japan in search of the best green teas for neoteas.com. But in this episode, we're going to be shifting the focus towards black tea. Let's get started. Okay, so what I have here are 4 different types of black teas. The first 3 are actually from Sri Lanka, and the last one is from Yunnan, so it's a Dienhong black tea. And these are very different in terms of price point and flavor, but they are similar in the fact that they are all under the same category of black tea. So what does black tea mean exactly? So black teas are fully oxidized, which separates them from green teas, which are unoxidized. And oolong teas fall somewhere in the middle, but most of the time we're focusing on green tea on this channel because most of the tea produced in Japan is green tea. There are some Japanese oolong teas and some Japanese black teas that you can find in some areas around Japan, but they're mostly known for the green teas. And in order to produce a green tea, the farmer will actually heat the tea leaves after the harvest. And what this does is it deactivates the enzymes that cause oxidation, and it allows the tea to lock in some of its like grassy vegetal flavor profiles that you would normally associate with a leaf. So if the farmer does not do this heat treatment of the tea leaves, they're going to start to oxidize over time. And during the oxidation process, the enzyme oxidase is going to convert polyphenols into theaflavins and thearubicins. And polyphenols are one of the compounds in the green tea that you associate with this kind of grassy or vegetal flavor, which is very typical of a green tea. And during the oxidation process, this turns into theaflavins and thearubicins, which are more of the kind of caramel, almost like brown sugar, a little bit chocolatey kind of flavor profiles. They can even get a little bit fruity, some of the black teas. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here because we want to taste out these teas and see what we notice in the taste profile. So before we brew these up, let's take a quick look at the leaves. These are all approximately 5 grams, but you'll see they look like they're different quantities. For example, these two look like they're very different amounts, but it's just because of the rolling style. So it's the same weight of tea leaves, but they're just processed a little bit differently. So this one is another example. The leaves are very flat, so they kind of occupy a lot of space. You have these light, flaky leaves. So they're not very heavy, but they kind of take up a lot of space. So this is just a good tip, actually. If you really want to be precise with your measurements, always go for the weight over just the physical size of the leaves if you want to be accurate, because some leaves are very tightly rolled, so they are very dense. This is another example. So this one is kind of the odd one out between these 3. These 3 are all kind of the same color. This one's a little bit different shaped. This one is obviously a different color, and the reason is because it has these buds in it. And if you look at these buds, kind of have these golden buds, and a lot of companies will kind of use this in their marketing. They'll say it's like the golden monkey tea or the golden tip tea, something like that. And this is because if you look at a plant, like any sort of plant really, when it has buds in the springtime, they are covered with these fine little white hairs, and these are called trichomes, and they're kind of like a way to protect the leaf, because it's very vulnerable when it's in the bud stage. And this is actually where white tea gets its name. So normally these buds are white, and if you have a bud-picked white tea, it's actually going to appear white. The leaves will appear white. This is where white tea gets its name. But during the oxidation process, these white leaves turn to like a nice golden color. So let's go ahead and brew these up. We're going to use, again, normally I would use, so we did a tasting recently with hojicha using this method. Normally I would prefer to use a teapot, but because I want to brew 4 different cups of teas all at once using kind of the same exact parameters, I think it's best to use these strainers. So that's what we're going to do today. Okay, so we're going to let all these teas brew for about 3 minutes because I'm using more of a Western style brewing with a smaller amount of leaves and a larger amount of water. What I like to do when I make black teas is usually use the gaiwan, and I use kind of rapid infusions of 15 to 35 seconds with 3 to 5 grams of water and 50 to 100 milliliters of water. But for right now, we're just going to do a basic test, and it's recommended to brew these teas for a little bit longer with the Western style brewing. So the reason why black tea can brew longer than green tea, and it can be brewed at a hotter temperature, I'm using about 90 degrees Celsius, maybe about 95 degrees Celsius, is because of these polyphenols and these catechins that we mentioned earlier. So if you were to brew a green tea with boiling water, you'd produce a lot of these bitter flavors, and this is coming from the catechins and the polyphenols that are extracted at higher temperatures. And this is really going to dominate the taste profile of the teas, and it's going to make them a little bit unpleasant to drink. But because there's less polyphenols in these black teas, they can stand up to higher temperatures and longer brewing times, so you can go for a couple minutes if you want. But just make sure to always follow the brewing instructions on the packet of each tea you get as closely as possible. So these teas will brew for another 30 seconds or so, and we're already noticing a difference in the colors of the ones in the middle specifically. And we'll talk a little bit more about these teas as we drink them, because I do have a little bit of information on each one that we'll go through. Go ahead and... The reason I'm doing this is because the strainer is actually not the best tool for doing this, because it's not giving the leaves enough space to open up. And this is why we recommend using a teapot. So the teapot is going to give the leaves more space to expand and release their flavor. You'll get a richer taste profile, more complexity in the tea. The strainer does the trick for loose leaf tea, but you're kind of missing out on a lot of the flavor. And you can kind of see this just by looking at the strainer. The leaves are kind of packed in here. Instead of, if you were to use a teapot, they would really be opening up towards the bottom of the teapot. So the reason I'm doing this little kind of dipping of the strainer a couple times is just to give them enough of an opportunity to release their flavor. So if you take a look at the colors, I would say these ones on the end are pretty similar. This one's darker. The two in the middle are a little more similar, but this one is by far the lightest. I'll get into that in a second. So first, let's start with this one. So the first thing that comes to mind when I drink this one is that it's very sour. So I get this sourness in the finish, and it's really kind of dominating the taste profile of this tea. So I've been drinking this tea for a while now. This is actually a cheap one that I got at a grocery store, and right away I was pretty impressed by the flavor. So I was expecting something to be really bad like I would get in a tea bag tea, and I was actually impressed because it was very, very inexpensive, and it had a pretty good flavor. But as I started drinking more black teas side by side with it, like these three, I noticed that there's really a lot lacking in the flavor, and what I was able to pinpoint is that this tea is just very sour. So you get this strong sourness that kind of dominates the taste profile. This one might go well with milk or something like that. If you're making like a chai or something like that, it would go pretty well. If you're mixing sugar, it's going to stand up well to sugar because the flavor is so bold. So if you're doing kind of like a mixed tea, a blended tea, this might work well. But if you're drinking on its own, I would recommend going for something a little bit higher quality. You're going to get more complexity in the flavor. So number two. This one, you're already noticing a little bit of an improvement. It's not nearly as sour as the first one. There is still a little bit of sourness to it. This is one of the ones I ordered online. I ordered these three from the same company, and this was by far the cheapest one of the three. And it does leave a little to be desired in the flavor, but it's still better than this one. I can sense that there's a little bit of like minerality in this tea, a tiny bit of fruitiness. Okay, this one is just a world apart. Right away, I noticed that there's a huge step up from this one to this one. This one's really fruity. There's like a little bit of peach to it. It's a little bit floral, I would say. Very, very good. So these are the 3 Sri Lankan teas. These 2 significantly less expensive than this one, but this one is also actually an affordable price. So I'm very impressed with this one so far. As you can see, even in the color, it's much lighter than the other teas that we have, and that kind of translates into the taste as well. Let's go for the last one, Dien Hong. Really, really good. Much richer in its flavor, much bolder. You get a lot more complexity with this one. With this one, I noticed there's like a tiny bit of that kind of fruity peachiness, which I really like in a black tea. For me, that's kind of like the gold standard. I know it's a little bit more complex than that, but I really like these slightly fruity flavors in a green tea, in a black tea. And this one has a really strong kind of fruitiness to it, but it also kind of has a little bit of that chocolatey finish, which I also really like. With this one, I'm also noticing a hint of this kind of menthol, like mintiness, which you sometimes get in a black tea. It's kind of like this, this kind of cooling flavor profile. If you've ever had like one of those white lifesavers, like the mint ones, it kind of is like a similar kind of sensation on the tongue, not nearly as strong, of course, but it is like this kind of cooling, minty sensation that you get. So a little bit of this fruity apricot or peach note, a little bit of that mentholated kind of coolness, and kind of a bitter dark chocolate in the finish. This one here, much more on these lighter kind of slightly more floral notes. But there is a little bit of that fruitiness in it, which I really like. So these 2 definitely the favorites. This one I would say is the best of the 4, just in my opinion. I'm actually biased towards these kind of Yunnan black teas. You know, like the golden buds, like we saw before. These tend to be the black teas that I really like. And these ones, I would say, kind of like your cheaper black teas, I would recommend mixing them with milk or sugar or something, because the flavor is just a little bit sour for daily drinking on its own. So I hope you all enjoyed this tasting. I hope we learned a thing or 2 about black teas. I certainly did. It was good to do all 4 of these side by side. I haven't done this before, and it really kind of allows me to understand the differences in the quality, kind of the flavor, but also in terms of price as we go from lowest to highest. So if you have any questions about tea, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you want to try one of our green teas, we would really appreciate it if you could go to neoteas.com and browse our selection. We have some really great teas that we found during our travels around Japan, and we think you're really going to like them. But until then, we'll see you guys next time.